in an almost strange way. It's even strange to me. This is like the lecture for which I had to do all the last 5, because all the 5 were in a way sort of a preparation for this one, because eventually there's no way you can get beyond that. The question of the evolution of language is the question that has to be given an answer in the end, because there's really in the absence of God from the picture, and the absence of the idea of creationism, this way or the other, and the only way we can explain how it is that language is, and how it is that we are speakers of languages, this way or the other, it has to be explained in evolutionary terms. This is in terms of like the most general framework, the most general framework that we have for understanding things at the moment is the evolutionary one. There are many, many ways to think about evolution. There are many, many ways to think about evolution, but eventually an evolutionary explanation has to be suggested. And I think, speaking in the most general terms possible, there have been, I would say, 2 or 2.5 types of attempts to explain the evolution of language. One is an attempt to stretch the idea of social evolution all the way to the end that we can find, the best end that we can find. So theories that basically say at a certain point in time a certain social development started, through which a symbolic system of the type that we know developed. Nothing significant happened on the way in terms of cognitive evolution. Nothing very significant happened to our brain. The development of language is more or less the same as we can think about the development of tools or the development of other elements of the societies, human societies as we know them. And then there is, of course, many different views on how that could have happened. There are many different views on how that could have happened. One very beautiful theory that we have is Dunbar's, for example, which talks about the social evolution of language as a tool of social communication as the gradual replacement of the social activity of grooming in the early hominids. What we know, and again, this is like in a nutshell, what we know about primate species such as chimpanzees and baboons and so on is that they spend an enormous amount of their time, 30 or 40%, some of them grooming others. And we also know that the process of the never-ending process of grooming is their way, one of their ways, the most important way of communicating social information about themselves, about others, about their role in the social hierarchy, about their status, who is grooming whom, and so on. All kinds of questions like that take a very, very big role in the social lives of primates. And what Dunbar claims is that there is a limit in terms of the number of individuals in a group of primates to this strategy, to the extent that you have more than a certain number of individuals. Grooming takes up all your day and you can't do anything else. And there was a need of a more time-efficient way of communicating social information, hence language. I'm giving you the story in half a minute. It is much more elaborate and more interesting than that. But the crux of the idea is something that can be understood very, very well if you simply think about language from Dunbar's point of view as a system for gossip. Language evolved for gossip, and the funny thing that people always connect to when they read Dunbar is that once you think about it, where you do the grooming today in the barber shop is exactly where you do most of the gossip. So there's like a sense of like continuity in barbershops and stuff. It's a very sophisticated theory with a lot of interesting things that I'm not going to get into, but it's just a good example, maybe the best example that we have of something that is about society and not about human cognition in any way. And that is exactly how you think about the evolution of language if you're thinking about it only in social terms. On the other hand, people like Bickerton, Pinker and Bloom, Jackendorf, and a lot of others from the Chomskyan part of things have been thinking about the evolution of language in terms that first try to understand what happened cognitively, and then once certain cognitive preconditions are met, allow the social evolution of languages to start moving. So two branches of these theories, two types. One says we had to have a sophisticated enough brain in general purpose terms, not just for language, but in all kinds of. We had to be smarter than a certain level to start the social evolution. So this kind of idea says there was cognitive evolution for a long time for other purposes, regardless of language. We simply became smarter and smarter than, much smarter than other primates. And at a certain point, we were smart enough to start language. There wasn't anything in our brain that was specifically linguistic, but we were just smart enough to do that. That's of course not the Chomskyan view, but these are people who are thinking about cognitive evolution before social evolution, and do not want to assume with Chomsky that there are certain specifically linguistic elements in our brain. There's no linguistic organ there. And the third view is one in which our brain has certain specific elements, a linguistic organ, a universal grammar, whatever you want to call it, in it. We are biological creatures capable of language. The linguistic organ must have evolved before languages began, before people started communicating with language, before there were many languages and so on. So our brain became a certain way that is specifically suited for the purposes of language, and then languages emerged because of that. Okay? And of course, this is why I said before 2.5 types of theories. So one social, and then two that are cognitive, but one that says general cognition before social evolution, and the other says specific cognitive evolution before social evolution. Okay, these are like 3 or 2.5 types of theories. And of course, all of them have their problems. The most serious problems are actually those of the Chomskyan view. And this is why Chomsky, as I said last week, preferred to say that the question of the evolution of language is a mystery and not a problem, because it is very obvious that it's very difficult to understand how a linguistic organ, a universal grammar, got into the hands of all human beings before anybody spoke any language, how this organ survived, why it was selected, why people who had the organ had selective advantage over others, and so on and so forth. It's just a dead-end idea, and I think that Chomsky, more than many of his followers, understood that very, very clearly from the very beginning. And he actually said something that, someone with a what's the word? With the self-confidence of a Chomsky can say that. He said that many times in a totally relaxed way. There is no real reason for me to change my linguistic theory just because evolutionary theory is not developed enough to understand how it happened. So this is the way things are, and if evolutionary theory has to develop more in order to understand how it happened, then we'll wait patiently. There was no sense ever in Chomsky's writings that there is something deeper or more fundamental or more important in evolutionary theory than in linguistic theory, and he discovered that there is a universal grammar in our brains. And now let the biologists try to find a way to explain that. Well, of course, they didn't, and it's very, it's totally a dead-end idea from the point of view of evolutionary theory. Then the other two types of theories are they are of course much better in terms of, you know, like it's much easier to imagine, for example, how the brain evolved for other purposes. For example, human brains have probably evolved for a long time because of the need to use tools or to develop more tools and so on. There's no real reason to oppose the idea that the human brain evolved for other reasons and then was smart enough to be able to start developing language. And there's no real reason to reject the other story too, in which we just had the brain and it was all about social evolution. But there's another set of problems that is actually, you know, Chomsky's forte. And that is another set of observations which Chomsky, you know, bases everything on. And these are the observations about child language, about language acquisition, and about the fact, not just about them, they are the most important, and other observations which very strongly suggest that there is something in our minds, in our brains, that is specifically related to language. Okay? So the first thing, and the most important thing, is a very, very long set of observations about child language and the way children acquire language. Very easily, almost effortlessly. If you think about the computational difficulty of the process, then you will see very quickly that it's probably one of the most difficult cognitive problems that we ever face, maybe the most difficult one, and without specific instruction, without sitting in classes and getting all the information. We do it quite easily as children. Doesn't matter if we have 3 or 4 or 5 languages around us. We're extremely smart in the way we do it, and at a certain point, just like anybody here who ever had to learn a 3rd or a 4th language at a later age, at a certain age, it seems that we're losing some of this capacity. It's very, very difficult, probably almost impossible, to reach native fluency in the language that you start learning at the age of 18 or 20. But if you see children, you know, moving from one place to the other at the age of 10, for example, then by the age of 12, they will sound almost probably like native speakers. And, you know, I think probably in this world that we live in, all of us here in the room know many examples, and probably many of us have actually gone through that personally, of, you know, the parents in an immigrant family, the parents and the older sibling who still carry the accent and so on, and the younger children who, you know, like this, sound completely native and so on. So there seems to be something that is very specific in the capacity to learn language, which is of course what Chomsky has stressed all the time. And the other theories find it quite difficult to explain. And also there's a whole set of things that are not about children, but about us as human beings, which are very, very remarkable pieces of evidence for the fact that we have somehow gone through some evolution specifically for language. Okay? The best examples for that, the best demonstrations of that are actually totally physiological. And I'll give you an example or two, but bear in mind that whenever there's physiological adaptation to something, there must be cognitive adaptation for it too, because otherwise the physiological adaptation wouldn't mean anything. So one of my favorite examples is the fact that we are all have the innately given capacity to use our lungs in a way that no other creature, no other mammal can use them. And it's actually very nice. There are two sets of muscles around our lungs, and in all mammals, these two sets of muscles have opposite functions. There's one set that expands the lungs so that we can breathe, and another set that deflates them so that we can, breathe out. And in all mammals, the two sets of muscles work like this all the time. And then in different animals, there are additional functions for these muscles, and all these additional functions are totally innate. So, for example, dogs have the innate capacity of doing that thing that breathing very, very quickly to cool themselves down. I don't know how you say that in English, but I think everybody who has seen a dog knows what I'm talking about. If we try to do that, we'll faint after a minute. It's a very specific capacity. Whales have very enormous capacity of keeping air in their lungs for a long time when they dive very deeply. We as humans use the muscles that are regularly used for inflating the lungs to get air. We also use them in order to slow down the process of deflation when we speak. So the lungs that are supposed to deflate our lungs and get the air out are used to work at a certain pace. And we need the air to get out of our lungs much slower for speaking. Okay? So what happens is when we deflate our lungs, the muscles that are there for the deflation do their regular work, but the other muscles also hold so that air will come out of the lungs much slower. It's a very funny thing. Try that at home. Don't try it now, but try to breathe at a regular pace and then try to speak at that pace. It's very, very difficult to do. And what happens to you after a second or two is you forget what you wanted to say because it's very, very difficult to actually do that. We have more muscles around our mouth and around our oral cavity than any other mammal by a very, very long stretch. We have a few hundred muscles around our mouth, whereas all the other mammals have a few dozen. And there's no way. You look at the structures of these muscles and what they are capable of doing. There is no other function. You don't need that for eating. The only function is this very, very complex activity of speaking. And if you just try to look at the normal pace of speaking, and you count the number of syllables that you can utter in a second, and then you understand what's happening in each of these muscles, how many movements of each and every muscle to change the position of the lips, to change the position of the whole oral cavity, to change the position of the lungs, what do you call it? The larynx, but the voice blocks and all that. So it's like a few hundred muscle commands a second, and we very, very obviously evolved to be able to do that, and we very obviously evolved to be able to do that for linguistic communication. There's no other explanation for that. So if you go with the theories that do not say anything about specific brain evolution for language, you find it much more difficult to explain what is happening at that level. So the theory that I want to present to you today is based. It is the theory that Eva Jablonka and I developed together. Eva Jablonka is an evolutionary biologist. We developed the theory together, and what I'll do, I'll talk about the theory, and then I will move on to talk about the specific elements of the theory that have to do with everything that we've talked about in the last 5 lectures, and mostly specifically about the relationship between language and experience, because that's where we are all the time. But the theory is basically a theory of the dynamic process that language and us went through in the process of evolution. And the general idea of the theory is that, again, as I think you've seen throughout all this series, there are conflicting sets of evidence, pieces of evidence, that need to be reconciled. And there is a very, very dire need to acknowledge that both sides to this argument have had something very, very true in what they were saying. What we need is a way to relate the different sets of observations to each other. The theory basically says the following thing. There are 2 separate processes of evolution that we have to think about. One is the social process of the evolution of language and languages, okay? And the process is totally continuous. It has started somewhere, sometime. We don't know when, we don't have the evidence for that moment of origin, although there are things that we can say about it, and I will say them later. But maybe it started at one place, maybe it started in different places. Social evolution in the sense that hominids at a certain early period started gradually to develop a system that eventually turned into the full-fledged system of instructive communication that we know now. They started using signs, they started pointing at things and giving them names, they started mutually identifying elements of experience that they could communicate about. Later on I will say a few words about the process. The social process has certain points in it which, in terms of simple logic, simply seem to have to happen either before or after others. So it seems very, very clear, I think, that the whole idea of a symbolic landscape, the whole idea of creating a model of the world that tells you something about the mutually identified similarities between the experiences of different individuals, all that must have happened in evolution before elements of the communication protocol have evolved, and later on I will explain why. So there's a lot of stuff to say about the process of social evolution that I will say later, but just one thing now. Try to think about it as a perfectly continuous process, without knowing the details. At one point somebody said a word, and now we have English and Turkish and Hebrew, just like that, because it's a very, very long process of social evolution in which these things went on developing all the time. Okay. Another element, another process that we have to think about is the process of cognitive evolution, which is a process in which human individuals became better and better users of the social system that they were developing. Okay? And you can think, for example, about human teeth. Okay? Something that you don't regularly think about when you think about language. They are very, very important. If we had teeth like horses, for example, we couldn't speak, because one of the most important phonetic facts about linguistic sounds is that you have to have you can't have gaps between the teeth, because otherwise the sound, the air makes all kinds of crazy turbulences, and you can't make sounds that are clear enough to distinguish. In order for us to be able to say t and p and f and v clearly enough for us to be able to identify them, we have to have teeth of a certain type, okay? So we have gone through an entire process of cognitive and physiological evolution. And even though I started talking about these two processes as independent of each other, and it is very, very important to understand their independence of each other because they are about two different things, the secret to the whole model that we built is in the specific relationship between these two processes, a relationship that says it is not the case that we first evolved cognitively and then evolved socially, but exactly the other way around. We first evolved culturally, and then evolved cognitively. Our cognitive evolution throughout the whole process was running after the social evolution. People were evolving because the environment in which they were genetically and otherwise selected became more and more an environment which selected them on the basis of their ability to use language. Okay? So let me try to describe a moment in this process, and it doesn't matter where we are. It may be a moment in the very beginning, or it may be a moment of, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, but in slightly more detail, show how that is possible. The first notion that is extremely important in our model, and actually everywhere today in evolutionary theory, the more people understand the relationship between cognitive development, as in youngsters, and evolution, the more they understand that, the more this notion becomes important, is the notion of brain plasticity. Okay? Totally crucial. The idea of brain plasticity says that regardless of what we are comfortably able to do on the basis of our genetic makeup and the environment, regardless of what we are suited to doing in a natural and comfortable way, there is always the extra ability that we have as cognitive and physiological entities to do for a while certain things that are not natural for us, because selective pressures are so strong that it's either we do these things or we totally do not survive. There is the ability to use our capacities in ways that were not originally the capacities for which these, there is a way to use the capacity for purposes which were not the original purposes for which the capacities evolved if the need arises. Okay? Look at Kanzi, for example. Okay? The bonobo chimpanzee who's been raised in America and at the moment uses around 250 words and sometimes connects two words into a short sentence and has actually invented a few words. You all know about Kanzi. By the way, I will say in parentheses, a very, very important development in science as far as I'm concerned, because the Kanzi family, himself, his mother, his sister, and all these, are, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, the first family of non-humans, which actually has a really serious biography. Looking at their relation, for example, his sister, Panbanisha, wasn't supposed to learn language. He was in a different project, and he was the one who was supposed to learn language. But they grew up together. She's much younger than he is. So it turned out at a certain point that she learned from him, and now she knows as much language as he does. And she was the first one who actually decided to start to write without anybody ever telling her to do it. Chimpanzees communicate with their researchers with sign language, and they push buttons on the computer. There's like this big thing with 250 signs, totally arbitrary signs, by the way. The sign for apple doesn't look like a small apple, it's just a sign. It would be very difficult for us to memorize these 250. It's a serious thing. And she at one point took a chalk and sat on the ground and started drawing the sign for apple, because she wanted an apple. Instead of pushing the button, she actually drew it. So we know a lot of what is happening there, because there are people who from very close range actually write the history and the biography of this family. And it's a very, very exciting thing, I think, for anybody who is interested in cognitive science, but also for anybody who likes animals. If you think about the way animals of this type were being held in zoos and places like that, then, it's really a terrible thing. Anyway, Kanzi, obviously, and his family obviously, had no genetic capacity specific to language. This is something nobody would argue about. They do not have language in the wild. The fact that Kanzi managed to do what he did, created a very, very long argument about whether we need or whether we don't need to assume genetic capacity for language in humans. But this is actually missing the whole point. The whole point is that Kanzi's cognition was plastic enough to be able to achieve certain things for which this cognition didn't evolve, something that went beyond the capacity, the regular purposes for which the capacity evolved. Okay. You know about brain plasticity, for example, from brain injury and injuries and brain injured people who, for example, turn out to use parts of, for example, the vision area in the brain, if they are blind, for hearing, okay? Or children who at a very early age have brain injuries and they seem to restructure their brain in a certain way for purposes that are new, all kinds of things like that. Cognition is plastic in general, much more than people assumed before. This is a crucial fact, and again I would say in parentheses, there is a very, very strong reason for why cognitions have to be at least plastic for a certain extent. There is selective advantage for plasticity, because the more plasticity you have, the more you're capable of finding new solutions to problems in new types of environments. So if your cognition is perfectly suitable for a certain type of environment, and it has 0% plasticity, then you're going to be perfectly fine as long as the environment doesn't change. But if the environment changes, you're lost. You are not going to be able to cope for 1 second. The more plastic your cognition is, the more you're capable of coping with environments that are changing. Okay? And this is not just a fact about human beings, it's a fact about all kinds of humans apart from, for example, insects. We know about insects that they have instincts that are almost totally unchangeable. Okay? So indeed, if you look at certain insect behaviors, as long as the environment fits those behaviors, they're just fine. We know that because they keep eating everything that we have. But as long as the environment changes, they are quite lost. Okay, there's at the moment a huge disappearing of bees around the world. I don't know if you knew about that, but it's like something that people who do research on insects are breaking their heads to try to understand what is going on. Most of the types of bees in America have disappeared in the last 20 years. Crazy stuff. And one of the things, nobody knows what is going on. Seriously, nobody knows what is going on. It's crazy. But one of the things that people are talking about is that maybe if something in the environment changed, and the environment changes, we're also worried about that. The capacity of the bees to change their behavior according to the new environment is zero. So if the environment doesn't fit, they're dead. Okay. So plasticity is a fact, and it is a very important fact. So think about a certain moment in which the social evolution of language started on the basis of the capacity for plasticity, meaning, and we'll get to the details later if we have time, meaning individuals who had nothing particular in their brains that was suited from the beginning to language started to develop types of behaviors that were, or continue developing types of behaviors that were linguistic in their social essence. So, for example, assume that we're in a certain situation in which, like bonobo chimpanzees or other types of vervet monkeys and so on, assume that you have a community of hominids which has a small number of alarm calls that they use, just like we know about certain other monkeys and primates. A different alarm call for hawks and other dangerous birds, a different type of alarm calls for lions and so on, predators who walk on the ground, and another alarm call for snakes. This is something that you get in many types of primates. And assume that on the basis of brain plasticity and the necessity that arises from very, very difficult life conditions, the group of hominids develops more signs, not 3 but 5, not 5 but 7. Not just for alarm calls, but for other things. Maybe another sign for food, and maybe a sign for directions, maybe something like the bees. We don't know exactly, of course, what these were, but let brain plasticity be enough for a certain while for this very rudimentary set of social habit to form, where the group now has a small set of signs, mutually identified, used for alarming others against danger or whatever. Okay. Now remember, we said, and that was the main lesson of last week, everything is variable all the way down, no universality ever. So you think about this community of hominids, then obviously you can see that at this very early stage, not all the members of the community are as good in handling this system, as rudimentary as it is, as all the others. So for example, there would be some individuals who would find the 7 signs very easy to use, and they would understand exactly what is happening and how to use them, and they would remember them very easily, and they would understand the exact relationship between danger and the sign and so on. And there would be others who would not be as good with it as others. Okay? We know from people who've been watching primates for a long time in the wild, for example, that there are individuals, sometimes the younger ones, the children, who do not always use the signs perfectly the way the adults do. So there's one little story that is told of a community, from a community of chimps, where a very young individual, a child, raised his head, thought he saw danger, gave the call for lion, for earth-walking predators. Everybody became very scared, of course. The mom looked around, saw nothing, gave the child a slap on the face, and they went on. So there was a lesson there, okay, you have to use it only when you see something clearly. So for example, not everybody is doing it in the right way, but there's also a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. So for example, some individuals are better at running to the trees than others. Some individuals are just stronger. Some individuals have better eyesight. They see the predators from further away and so on. There's variability, not just all the way down, but all through the place. Now, because of brain plasticity, there's a system of 7 signs and not 3. At a certain point, what you'll start getting is certain individuals who are, first, not good runners, do not have very good eyesight, but also find it more and more difficult to cope with the complexity of the new system, the linguistic system. What you'll get once this, you let this situation go on, because the pressures of the environment are remaining very, very strong. The environment remains dangerous and difficult. What you get is a situation where, from that generation, say, on to the next one, certain individuals who are at the lower, the most low level of capacities of the entire community in terms of the combination of all the relevant properties, they will fall off the race. Okay? Those individuals who cannot benefit from just running very quickly and cannot benefit from fighting the lion. There are some males who can do that, in the baboons, for example, but also find it very difficult, for example, to understand what the sign said. Okay, distinguishing between the sign that says snake and the one that says lion can cost you your life. So those who were incapable of doing that would not have the same number of children as the others, and they would, say, fall off the track. In the next generation, you'd get another pattern of variability between the different individuals, in which the general capacity of the entire community to use the social system of language is just slightly higher than the capacity of the generation before. Okay, but note again, a lot of individuals will survive and have offspring on the basis of other capacities, and also a lot of individuals would survive because they would find different ways, different strategies to handle the social system of language. So it's not like everybody is going to genetically develop in the same direction. Because, for example, think about those signs. One individual may be extremely good in remembering the different signs and what each of them means, and the others are not going to be that good with that. But another individual is going to be excellent in producing the different signs with such clear sounds that the others are going to find it easier to distinguish between them. Okay, so one of them is going to be, if you want in very informal terms, more talented for phonetics, another would be more talented for semantics, another one would be a better experiencer, and so on. And all these different capacities are going to survive for the next generation because they have given some selective advantage to those individuals. In this new group of people, what you're going to, in this new generation, what you're going to find is the following thing. The capacity is going to be slightly different and slightly more suited to this new environment, but also there's going to be plasticity just like there was before. So certain things for which the people in the first generation needed to kind of stretch their plastic capacity are going to be easier for the people in the next generation because they are already more suited for the task, which means that more of their plasticity would be released for more innovation. Okay, this is what we call, Eva and I, on the basis of another book that she wrote, the stretch-assimilate process. Okay, what does that mean? You stretch your plastic capacity, then your genetic assimilates to what you manage to do, then your plasticity is released in order to stretch again, then your genetics runs after it again, and at every point in this process of evolution, individuals who are the offspring of individuals who were better at this game in the last generation are going to be able to, say, go from 7 signs to 15. If they're going to be able to go from 7 to 15, some of the other individuals who found it okay to handle 7 are going to find it very, very difficult to handle 15. So another, subset of the people are going to fall off the track, and the entire community is going to find itself in a spiral in which at every generation there is a more sophisticated system of communication, a more sophisticated language, and because there is more sophisticated language, life is going to be harder for more people to cope with this. And it's a process in which eventually you can get to a point where the language is very, very sophisticated, and the individuals are, one, most of them, capable of handling it, because the languages that we speak today for us are at the same level of complexity as the languages that were spoken in the very beginning were for their speakers. Okay? We look at ourselves at the moment and we see the very same thing. We see there are some people who find it very, very easy to speak, to express themselves, to speak clearly, to arrange their thoughts in a certain way according to the logical constraints of that the language imposes on you. Some people are much better than others in remembering words and their meanings and relating experiences to semantics and so on and so forth. The whole thing, everything that you want to think about, we are in the very same situation. We are in a situation in which the language that is spoken in the society is still the selective environment in which we as human beings are selected. We are not selected directly in terms of the number of offspring that we will have, obviously, because a lot of things happen in terms of the relationship between society and genetics, but we're still selected in many ways on the basis of language, not just socially in terms of what we can do in life and so on. But let me give you an example that I think kind of gives you a sense of what is happening. Think about dyslexia. Okay, there are two facts about dyslexia that basically tell you the whole story. First, there is a very, very clear genetic basis for dyslexia. Second, there couldn't be possibly a genetic basis for dyslexia. Both things are correct because we have never, it's obvious that we have never gone through an evolutionary process for reading. Because when we stopped evolving the way we did throughout the entire evolution, when the question of the number of offspring that we have stopped being the only element that is involved, nobody read and nobody wrote. I mean, this is quite obvious. We did go through a process a genetic process for reading. Okay. However, dyslexia is genetic. Okay. We know that very clearly, for example, because we know that it goes from generation to generation in families in a process that is, Mendelian genetic patterns, like what you see on the black pieces of corns. It's very obvious that it's genetic. What is happening here? What is happening here is exactly what has happened throughout the whole process of evolution. First, there is a social habit that is being formed. Okay? It is being formed by individuals through a process of social history who are either very innovative or very smart or just lucky, and they had a need, and it happened. It happened, and there are experts on the social history of writing and reading who tell us a lot of very, very detailed things about that, what writing and reading were used for in the beginning, how it evolved, the different systems, whatever you want. There comes a time in which, socially speaking, the capacity of reading and writing is universalized. Again, for social, political, whatever reasons, you get to the point where all or most children have to go to school and learn to read and write. This is a very, very new development, as you obviously know. 18th century is a good point in time to start talking about it as in like real masses of people. However, from the point that reading and writing becomes part of the social environment and children start being selected, not in terms of the number of offspring that they will have, but in other terms, like for example success in school, social appreciation, whatever, are starting to be selected on the basis of their ability to work with this social technology. What is revealed is a whole new level of variability in genetic capacities that were never isolated before, but are now being isolated for the new behavior that is required in the society. So writing and reading is not something we evolved for, but once writing and reading happen around us and we have to participate, a whole level of genetic differences between us is exposed by this type of behavior. So if you look at what is happening with dyslexic children, you'll see that there is actually an enormously complex set of cognitive capacities that are required for reading and writing. And this specific combination of capacities was never around until we had to start using it. Until the environment told us, you have to connect all these capacities together and do something with it. And once the social environment told us that, all of a sudden it turned out that some of us are genetically more suited for this task than others. Okay? So I think it was 2 weeks ago or something, when Catherine, when I said not all human beings have language, some people have, brain problems or cognitive problems and so on, and you asked about, so why are you counting them? If you think about the process the way I'm talking about it, you can imagine, for example, a very, very long stretch of time in the beginning of the process in which it simply wasn't all the individuals in human communities who spoke. You can think about it just like you may think about computers now. You may think, for example, about certain generations in which some youngsters used a system and the elderly wouldn't cope with it. Or you can think about a situation in which the capacity was arranged by class or hierarchy or family membership. A situation where not everybody was capable of using the system, or not everybody was supposed to use the system, or whatever. And a process in which, as the system became universalized, more and more capacities, some of them genetically based, and more importantly, certain combinations of capacities that weren't tried before, had to be recruited for the social activity of language. Now, if you think about dyslexic children, what you see is a very, very interesting fact. First, there's variability among them that is huge. Okay? It's not a fact about certain people. Dyslexia is a name that we give to an enormous set of different things, both in terms of the severity of it. So some children may be, children are in Western countries with relatively good education can read and write well by the 3rd grade, let's say, or the second or 3rd grade. Some children take till the 6th or 7th grade because they are dyslexic. Some children never get there, okay? But also, more importantly, dyslexic children find all kinds of unbelievably innovative ways of going beyond the difficulty. So, for example, a lot of dyslexic children who simply cannot, and this is, I have a child who, was struggling with that a lot, and it was very, very serious, it was a very serious moment of really understanding, doesn't matter, the smartest kid on earth, and you look at the combination of letters, and they keep changing the place for her, she sees them in the wrong direction, and there's nothing you can do about it. It drives you nuts, but there's simply nothing to... She decided at a certain point that she's just going to learn how whole words look like. So just like Chinese, so think about every word, forget about the fact that you have B and have the letters B and C and D in different words, just every word looks a certain way. So she just memorized the lexicon as words, okay? And there's a lot of dyslexic children, for example, find ways of reading in which they go through the text. There are certain words that they can identify, and then they start building a story for themselves about what the others would be, and they start all kinds of hypotheses and stuff. So here you are in a situation in which a certain social process that eventually resulted in the universalizing of reading and writing in society exposed genetic variability that wasn't relevant until then, created a group of people who are now called, someone with a brain problem, but the brain problem is a result of a social process. And they then begin their own culture in which they start finding all kinds of innovative ways of getting beyond that, and so on and so forth. So it is a process in which first, you start with the social level, and then you get into a spiral in which the social level keeps dragging the cognitive level after it. That's the first thing. The second thing, it is a process that results eventually in innateness, but it is different from innateness the way Chomsky thought about it in two crucial ways. First, this innateness is not the basis for language, but the other way around. It is a result of language. Language as a social development dragged our brains, our minds, to a position where we are now in a position as children to cope with the complexity of the languages that we have now, just like much earlier hominids were in a position to cope with much simpler languages. Okay, so innateness is a result, not a foundation. Okay, and probably most importantly, innateness is qualitative and variable, and not qualitative and universal. It is not the fact, as a result of this process, that we all have a universal language organ in our minds that is the same in all human beings. It is the fact that even if the great majority of us, when we are born into the world, find it relatively easy to learn the languages at the complexity in which we know them today, which is what we know about children, it is still the fact that our capacities are different from each other. And if you look at language acquisition, the domain of research of language acquisition, then one of the most, for me, unbelievable facts about this domain is the following. Most of what was written about language acquisition in the last 50 years has been about how the capacities of different children are exactly the same. So you go to every textbook, every more advanced book about language acquisition, and you'll see, for example, that there are stages in which children go from one step to the other. So, at the age of 9 months, for example, the child is capable of looking at where the finger of the parent points and understand that there's a relationship between the sign and the thing. At around a year and a half, there's what's called the two-word stage, in which the children for the first time connect more than one word to each other. And then at the age of 2.5 and 3, there's supposed to be syntactic development, and the rates of development are supposed to be the same, and so on and so forth. A huge effort of showing that all children go through the process in the same way. But everybody who has done longitudinal, how do you say this? You can never say that. Longitudinal research, just following children for a long period of time, and if you have children of your own, then whether you do the research or not, you just see that. The best kept secret of the discipline, of the domain of language acquisition, is that children actually use extremely different strategies in the process of language acquisition. Children are very different from each other when they acquire language. So, for example, there would be the child, first of all, before we even start, there's something that is almost horrible, but it's a fact. When you look at all these books, you see those stages and the times and the temporal points in which they happen. Of course, these are statistical generalizations about big numbers of children. What is happening to new parents when they look at these things, especially when it's popularized, is like, somebody should be put in prison for that, because you look at your child, she's already a year and 3 months old, and she still hasn't gone through the process that she was supposed to start last week. You run like crazy to the doctor, and you ask, what's wrong with my daughter and stuff. And today in Western countries, there's a whole industry. I can't even start to describe to you how big this industry is of taking money from young parents to do, to help their children cope with language, and in 99.9% of the situations, you are a very worried parent, and you bring your child at the age of a year and a half to the clinic and they say, okay, we'll work with her on her vowels.